Chapter 2: Higher Self, Lower Self, and Mask. Blessed is this hour in which I am permitted to speak to you, my friends. You all know that you have not only a physical body, but also various subtle bodies, each representing something different. Your thoughts have definite spiritual forms, and such forms are created not only by thoughts, but also by feelings, since a feeling is really just an unthought thought, not yet made conscious. Although thought creates a different form than a feeling does, nevertheless, both create very definite and substantial forms. Each subtle body, as well as the physical body, has an aura, the vibration and emanation of that body. These forms really do exist in the spirit. All these forms fluctuate and change since everything in spirit is in perpetual motion. The aura of the physical body shows physical sickness or health and all other conditions of the physical being. The emotional, intellectual, or spiritual reactions show in the aura of the respective subtle body. Each living being has a higher self or divine spark. This is the finest and most radiant of the subtle bodies, with the quickest frequency of vibration, because the higher the spiritual development, the quicker the vibration. The higher self has surrounded itself slowly and gradually with various layers of denser matter, not quite as dense as the physical body, but infinitely denser than the higher self. Thus did the lower self come into existence. The aim of spiritual development is to eliminate the lower self so that the higher self becomes free again of all outer layers it has acquired. In your own life, you will be able to sense quite easily with yourself or others that certain parts of the higher self are already free, while other parts are still hidden. How much is free or hidden, and how quickly it is hidden, depends on the overall development of the person. The lower self consists not only of the common faults and the individual weaknesses that vary with each person, but also of ignorance and laziness. It hates to change and conquer itself. It has a very strong will that may not always manifest itself outside, and wants its way without paying the price. It is very proud and selfish and always has a great deal of personal vanity. All these characteristics are generally part of the lower self, regardless of other individual faults. We can determine very well which thought forms come from the higher self and which come from the lower self. We can also determine which tendencies, wishes, and endeavors from the higher self may be mixed with the tendencies from the lower self. When messages from the higher self are tainted with lower self motives, a disorder is created in the soul that makes its bearer emotionally ill. For example, a person may want something selfish, but because he or she does not want to admit inwardly that this is selfish, begins to rationalize this selfish desire and fool himself about it. not want to admit inwardly that this is selfishness, begins to rationalize this selfish desire and fools himself about it. We can see this kind of common self-deception in human beings because the forms of the higher self have an entirely different character than those of the lower self. There is another layer that is, unfortunately, not yet recognized sufficiently among human beings for its full significance, and that is what I might term the masked self. The masked self is created in the following way. When you recognize that you may get into conflict with your surroundings by giving in to your lower self, you may nevertheless not be ready to pay the price to eliminate the lower self. This would mean, first of all, that you would have to face it as it really is with all its motives and drives. Since you can conquer only that which you are fully aware of, this means taking the narrow path, the spiritual path. Many people do not want to think that deeply. Instead, they react emotionally without thinking about how their lower self may be involved in their reaction. The subconscious mind feels it necessary to present a different picture of the self to the world in order to avoid certain difficulties, unpleasantness, or disadvantages of any sorts. Thus, people create another layer of the self which has nothing to do with reality, either with that of the higher self or with the temporary reality of the lower self. This superimposed mask is what you might call phony. It is unreal. I will return to the above example. The lower self dictates to the person to be quite ruthless about a selfish desire. It is not difficult for anyone of even the most limited intelligence to realize that by giving in to this desire, he or she will be ostracized or disliked by others, an outcome no one wants. Instead of overcoming the selfishness by the slow process of development, such a person often acts as though she or he were already unselfish. But she actually is selfish and feels the selfishness. Her giving in to public opinion and her generosity are just a sham, not at all reconciled with her true feelings. In other words, the right act is in this case entirely unsupported by the unpurified inner feelings, and therefore the person is at war within. The proper act becomes an act of necessary compulsion instead of free choice. Such a superimposed goodness does not pay the price in the real sense. While a person may give something, he may hate the idea. Not only is such a person selfish within by inner conviction, but he is also untrue to his nature, violating his reality and living a lie. I am by no means suggesting that it is advisable to give in to one's lower nature. One must fight for enlightenment and strive for development in order to purify one's feelings and desires. But if this is not accomplished, there should at least be no self-deception. The person should have at least a clear and true picture about the discrepancy between feelings and actions. In this way, no masked self can form. Ending self-deception. However, it is too often the case that such a person tries to believe in his own unselfishness, and in that way fools himself about his real feelings and motives by not showing them and not wanting to look at them. After a while, the evil root will sink into the subconscious, where it will ferment and create forms that have their effect and cannot be eliminated, because the person is unaware of them. The example of selfishness is merely one instance. There are many other traits and tendencies that go through the same process, my friends. When people are emotionally sick, it is always a sign that in one way or another, a masked self has been created. They do not realize they are living a lie. They have built a layer of unreality that has nothing to do with their real being. Thus, they are not being true to their real personality. As I said before, being true to oneself does not mean that you should give in to your lower self, but that you should be aware of it. Do not fool yourself if you still act according to the necessity to protect yourself and not out of enlightened vision and inner conviction. Be aware that your feelings are still unpurified in this or that respect. Then you have a good basis from which to start. It will be easier for you to face yourself in this manner when you realize that underneath the layers of your lower self lives your higher self, your ultimate and absolute reality, which you must eventually reach. In order to reach it, you must first face your lower self, your temporary reality, instead of covering it up, because that puts an even greater distance between you and absolute reality or your own higher self. To face the lower self, you must at all costs tear down the masked self. You can bring yourself to do so when you visualize the three selves I am discussing here. To lie to oneself and not think about one's emotions and true motives at all, but merely to let the emotions react without thinking, may appear at times adequate, but it is not. The person who wants to become happy, healthy, and at peace inwardly needs, in order to truly fulfill this present life and be in harmony with God, and thus with the inner self, to find the answer to these questions once and for all. What is the actual me? What is my higher self? What is my lower self? Where may there be a mask, a falsehood? It is important for all of you to try to train your inner eye to see yourself and other human beings from this point of view. The more you become spiritually awake, the easier it will be for you to accurately perceive yourself and others. When you come in contact with the higher self, once your intuition has awakened through your personal spiritual development, you will feel a distinct difference between the mask and the higher self. You will feel the unpleasant manifestations of the masked self. First of all, of your own, no matter how pleasant the mask you may appear to be. What then remains to be accomplished is to penetrate the subconscious layers of the personality with these truths as well, so that all inner resistance will be overcome. If you want to walk this path and be cured of your emotional sickness, it is important for you to understand all this. You will have to face the lower self, which exists in each human being, but also know that this lower self is not the ultimate I or true self. The higher self, which is perfection, waiting to grow out of these layers of imperfection, is the true self. Perhaps you have questions on this subject, my dear friends. Question: how is it possible to undo what your lower self has manifested in the way of physical illness? Answer: in the first place, you should not try to eliminate the consequences first. If your lower self has created an illness, the illness has to be accepted first. You should go about finding the roots or the part of your lower self that has created the illness. The lower self has to be met and completely explored. Your aim must be purification and perfection for its own sake. You do it for the love of God that you have in you, and not in order to avoid putting up with the discomfort. True, it takes a lot of overcoming and inner strength to sufficiently purify the motives first, but that is the necessary foundation. While doing this, you are at the same time learning many other things. Spiritual strength grows as you learn to apply absolute self-honesty. Once your motives are pure, the sickness will not matter half as much as the state of your soul. To the degree that the ego and the comfort of all that goes with it loses importance, you will have followed a very important spiritual law. Your spiritual health will be gradually restored. This law has to do with the giving up of the ego self, which Jesus taught. Only in so doing will you win your life. So begin by meeting your lower self with courage, optimism, humility, and in a spirit of discovery. Once you discover your lower self and shed all the masks and all the covering layers, you will begin to work on these different aspects of the lower self. You do this by daily self-observation and self-testing, observing again and again how far your inner currents will deviate from what you wish them to be. As you do so and become a master over your lower self, you learn real self-honesty, and your motives for development become purer and purer. Your vision will widen, enlightenment will be given to you, and your symptoms and problems will gradually disappear. So you should not even think of your illness first, but of the root of the problem. That will be the only lasting success. If you truly want to purify yourself, not merely rid yourself of unpleasant consequences that are most visible or noticeable to you. Help and guidance will come to you so that you can do battle with your lower self, since no one can do it alone. And with that, my friends, I will leave you. Go your way in peace. Know that God is present within you.